Dawn rose slowly over the Pacific. A thin mist hung over the water, tinted gold by the first light. On a jagged ridge above the shoreline, a handful of Japanese soldiers stood motionless, their uniforms faded, their eyes hollow from months of hunger and malaria. One of them, a young lieutenant, raised his binoculars. What he saw froze his breath. Across the horizon, the sea shimmered with an impossible sight. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of gray silhouettes emerging from the morning haze. Battleships, carriers, transports, columns of landing craft forming endless lines that vanished into the distance. The ocean itself seemed made of steel. Engines thundered beneath the waves. Sky filled with the distant hum of aircraft circling above the fleet. The sound arrived like rolling thunder, the pulse of an empire far greater than their own. No words were spoken, only the slow tightening of fists, the quiet tremor in the lieutenant's jaw. For a long moment, they stared in silence. Soldiers of an empire now staring into its own eclipse. They realized then the empire's sun was setting. Before the sea turned against them, the soldiers of Japan had once believed themselves unstoppable. In the early 1940s, the Empire of Japan stood at the height of its power, a rising sun stretching from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Central Pacific. The world had watched in astonishment as, in a matter of months, Japanese forces achieved what no Asian nation had ever done before. They defeated the Western empires at their own game. From the airfields of Formosa, bombers struck the American fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet and opening the gates of expansion. Across the vast Pacific, Japanese troops swept through the Philippines, captured Hong Kong, seized Malaya and Singapore, and rolled into the Dutch East Indies with stunning speed. The victories were intoxicating. Tokyo broadcast them as proof that spirit, discipline, and divine destiny could overcome even the industrial might of the West. The Bushido Code, the ancient warrior, ethos of loyalty and sacrifice became the ideological heart of Japan's modern war machine. Every soldier, sailor, and pilot was told that the emperor himself watched over their duty. Dying for him was not tragedy, but honor. Factories worked around the clock. Shinto shrines overflowed with prayers for victory. Propaganda films showed samurai ghosts rising from the mist, merging with modern soldiers charging across tropical beaches. In those years, Japan's expansion seemed endless. Its navy ruled the Pacific, its Zero fighters danced through the skies, and its army advanced across Asia like a tide. Even the most seasoned Western commanders were forced to admit Japan had unleashed a new kind of warfare. Swift, precise, fanatically determined. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Japan's empire had expanded too far, too fast. Its victories depended on momentum, on the belief that speed and courage could replace industrial resources. Yet every island taken, every front opened, stretched the empire's lifeline thinner. The resources that fueled the war, oil, steel, rubber, had to be seized abroad and shipped thousands of miles across ocean routes now vulnerable to Allied submarines. American codebreakers were already reading Japanese signals. The tide of war, invisible but relentless, had begun to turn. By mid-1942, the illusion of invincibility met its first shock. At Midway, Japan's carrier fleet, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was ambushed and shattered. 4 of its finest carriers burned and sank in a single day. The loss was more than ships. It was the destruction of experience, of pilots trained since the 1930s, irreplaceable in a nation with limited oil and fuel. Still, Japan fought on. At Guadalcanal, soldiers battled to the last man, refusing to surrender even when cut off from food or ammunition. The Imperial Army called it a spiritual victory. In truth, it was a warning. devotion could not feed an army, nor stop the growing reach of American production. As the months passed, the Pacific turned into a war of attrition. For every plane Japan lost, America built 10. For every destroyer sunk, the Americans launched another from their endless shipyards in California and New York. And yet, in Tokyo, the rhetoric never changed. Newspapers spoke of certain victory. Children drilled with bamboo spears. The emperor's voice, calm and distant, echoed across radios, an eternal reassurance that the gods still favored Japan. But among the soldiers in the field, doubt had begun to whisper. Men who once marched with songs now stared at empty supply crates. Units on remote islands went months without resupply, living on coconuts and rainwater. The wounded lay in makeshift tents, whispering prayers to a homeland they would never see again. The spirit of Bushido held them together. But spirit alone could not fill the skies, could not build convoys, could not win a war fought on machines. The empire's reach had touched its limit, and somewhere beyond the horizon, America was preparing something the world had never seen. An armada built not from pride, but from pure industrial power. By 1944, the tide had turned completely. The Pacific, once a vast ocean of Japanese victories, was now shrinking, island by island, mile by mile. The United States Navy, rebuilt from the ashes of Pearl Harbor, had returned with a scale of power the world had never imagined possible. Through Operation Cartwheel, the Solomons, the Gilberts, and the Marshalls, the Allies carved their way across the Pacific, isolating Japan's strongholds and starving them into irrelevance. The strategy was methodical. Take one island, bypass the next, cut the supply lines, and let the trapped garrisons wither. Entire Japanese divisions, tens of thousands of men, were left to die on forgotten islands, their commanders still sending hopeless radio messages to Tokyo, unaware that help would never come. Behind these victories was not only courage, but industrial genius. America had turned its economy into a war engine. Shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than Japan could sink them. Aircraft carriers rolled out of factories every few weeks. The scale was mechanical, unfeeling, a tide of steel replacing the tide of men. By mid-1944, Japan was fighting on starvation rations. Its fuel reserves, once drawn from the Dutch East Indies, were nearly gone. The Imperial Navy, which had once ruled the seas, now feared to leave port. Training flights were grounded. Warships sat immobile, unable to refuel. Yet the war demanded sacrifices even in despair. The High Command ordered its forces to fight to the death, to resist every invasion with suicidal resolve. If America advanced, Japan would make them pay for every step. That grim doctrine came to life in the Mariana Islands. At Saipan and Tinian, Japanese defenders fought until almost none remained. Entire units committed mass suicide rather than surrender. When the American Marines finally secured the islands, they found cliffs where civilians, convinced by propaganda that Americans would torture them, had leapt to their deaths with their children. And from those newly captured islands, American bombers could now reach Tokyo itself. The psychological tide shifted. For the first time, Japanese soldiers in the field realized that the war could be lost. Their families were no longer beyond reach. The homeland itself was vulnerable. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Americans prepared for the next great leap. The Philippines, strategically vital, symbolically immense. General Douglas MacArthur had sworn to return, and now he would, backed by the greatest armada ever assembled. In the months leading up to the invasion of Leyte, the Japanese command understood the stakes. If the Philippines fell, Japan would be cut off from the oil and resources of Southeast Asia. The Imperial Navy gathered what ships it could still move: battleships, cruisers, and carriers, for one last decisive engagement. It would be a gamble of everything that remained. But on the shores of Leyte, the defenders knew what awaited them. Radio reports described American convoys so vast that pilots mistook them for land masses. Reconnaissance photographs showed harbors filled with rows of ships stretching beyond the horizon. For men who had spent months scavenging for food, the sight of such abundance was incomprehensible. In Tokyo, officials spoke of honor and destiny. But in the bunkers and observation posts along the Philippine coast, soldiers whispered something else: that the Americans had become a force beyond human scale. Every night, they watched the horizon. Every morning, they heard the distant hum of aircraft engines echoing across the sea. Each sound was a reminder that the ocean, once Japan's shield, had become its enemy. Then, on October 20th, 1944, as dawn broke over the Gulf of Leyte, the waiting ended. The horizon came alive with motion. Waves of landing craft, columns of transports, rows of battleships and carriers. The sea itself seemed to move. Those who witnessed it would never forget. The endless convoy stretched farther than the eye could follow, a gray tide of steel carrying an entire nation's power across the Pacific. And on the cliffs above the bay, Japanese soldiers watched in silence, realizing that no amount of courage, no number of bayonets or prayers, could stop what was coming. The war had entered its final, merciless phase, and from that moment on, the word hopeless would no longer be forbidden. They were young men, most barely past 20, sons of farmers, fishermen, and factory workers, bound by an unspoken belief that the emperor's cause was sacred. When they first sailed south from Japan, they carried themselves with quiet pride. Their letters home spoke of honor, of the duty to protect the nation from Western encirclement. They were told they were fighting for Asia's liberation, for the divine spirit of Yamato. But by 1944, that faith had begun to fracture. On the front lines, they slept in muddy foxholes filled with mosquitoes and fear. Food came rarely, rice mixed with insects, the occasional captured tin of American rations considered a treasure. Disease claimed more men than bullets. There were no reinforcements, no medical supplies, only orders. Orders to hold, orders to die. They still bowed toward the emperor's palace every morning, even when they no longer believed rescue would come. They carried their bayonets polished, their boots patched with wire and cloth. Yet inside, they understood that the empire's promises had turned hollow. Some soldiers wrote in their diaries, fragile notebooks that would later be found by Allied troops. The words were quiet, restrained, almost poetic. "We have no more ships. The enemy has endless ones. We cannot fight the sea." Still, they stood their ground, not out of hope, but out of the only thing left: duty. When the horizon filled with gray shapes, some whispered that they were seeing the world's end. Others knelt and prayed. A few tried to convince themselves that perhaps the Americans would falter. None did. The silence that followed was not surrender. It was the sound of men realizing that courage alone could no longer save them. For the United States, the Pacific War was not just fought. It was engineered. Every battle, every beach, was a calculation in logistics. The American military had learned that control of the sea was not won by individual bravery, but by the ability to move everything: fuel, ammunition, tanks, men, food, across thousands of miles without interruption. In 1943, U.S. naval planners perfected what they called the amphibious conveyor belt, a continuous rotation of convoys moved between American shipyards, island bases, and forward battle zones. As one fleet unloaded, another was already en route. When a destroyer was sunk, another took its place within weeks. Behind every invasion stood a vast, unseen machine: dock workers in California, welders in Detroit, farmers in Iowa, all working as one organism. It was total war, industrialized. By the time of Leyte, the Americans had assembled more than 700 ships for the landing. An oceanic city in motion. Fleet carriers, escort carriers, battleships, destroyers, landing craft, repair ships, oilers, floating dry docks, all moving in precise coordination. Japanese scouts watching from the hills could not comprehend it. To them, it seemed impossible that such scale existed. While Japan clung to spiritual strength, the United States had mastered material rhythm. Its soldiers rotated out of battle to rest and recover. Its fleets carried refrigeration, field hospitals, and entertainment troops. Even war had become efficient. When the order came to invade Leyte, MacArthur's headquarters executed it like a factory operation. Intelligence aircraft mapped every beach and tide. Engineers prepared floating piers. Radio operators synchronized across thousands of miles. The Japanese command had no counter. Their communications were fractured, their airfields crippled, their navy low on fuel. For every Japanese bomber that took off, 10 American fighters waited above the fleet. From a purely tactical view, the war had already been lost long before the first American boots hit the sand. The Japanese defenders on Leyte fought with desperation, but they were fighting the future, an age of mechanized warfare that no empire could resist. And yet, in that clash of eras, something deeply human lingered. The sight of the endless convoy, of a sea turned to metal, marked not just the defeat of Japan's army, but the passing of an idea. That honor could conquer steel, that spirit could triumph over production. The Pacific was no longer a battlefield, it had become a mirror, reflecting two worlds. One built on faith, the other on factories. And as the soldiers stared across that horizon, they realized which world would endure. The Pacific War was more than a clash of armies. It was the collision of two civilizations, one driven by faith, the other by factories. When the Japanese soldiers at Leyte saw the endless convoy, they were not simply witnessing ships. They were looking at the embodiment of industrial warfare perfected. Every vessel in that gray expanse had a purpose. There were transports carrying tanks and bulldozers, machines that would turn jungle beaches into airfields within hours, oilers pumping lifeblood into destroyers and carriers without ever returning to port, hospital ships with operating rooms that gleamed under white lights, floating workshops capable of rebuilding engines, refitting guns, even manufacturing spare parts while at sea. The scale defied imagination. By 1944, the United States had produced over 5,000 cargo ships, 100 aircraft carriers, and 80,000 landing craft. Shipyards operated 24 hours a day. In one of Henry Kaiser's yards in Richmond, California, a Liberty ship could be built from keel to launch in under 5 days. That industrial rhythm gave the U.S. Navy something Japan could never match: permanence. The Pacific was vast, but America had made it small. For Japan, technology had once been a symbol of pride. Its navy had stunned the world in 1905 at Tsushima. Its Zero fighter had ruled the skies in 1941. But by 1944, innovation had frozen. Factories bombed, resources depleted, engineers drafted into combat. The few remaining research projects, radar, jet prototypes, improved torpedoes, remained incomplete. Strangled by scarcity. The Americans, meanwhile, built a system that transformed chaos into clockwork. From radio coordination to mobile dry docks, from floating fuel depots to portable runways, they redefined what an army could be. To the Japanese defenders, it appeared almost supernatural. How could a nation so distant, separated by an entire ocean, deliver endless steel and men with such precision? How could ships appear faster than they could be sunk? They began calling it the conveyor of death. For the first time in history, War had become a continuous process. Production feeding transport, transport feeding battle, battle feeding victory, all synchronized by machines. What those soldiers saw on the horizon was not just an invasion. It was the future arriving, a future where wars would be won not by the strongest warrior, but by the most efficient system. The convoy was not an army. It was civilization in motion. Inside the Japanese trenches, morale had become a fragile thread stretched between honor and despair. They had been raised to believe that the Japanese spirit, Yamato Damashi, was indestructible. That courage could overcome any hardship, any enemy. For decades, it had been the foundation of their identity. That one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Western ones because his soul was pure, his devotion absolute. But when they saw the convoys filling the horizon, that belief faltered. No one could look at a sea of over 1,000 ships, carriers, destroyers, transports, endless, and still believe that spirit alone would prevail. For many, it was not fear they felt, but something heavier: futility. The diaries recovered from Leyte and later Okinawa reveal this quiet breaking of faith. One soldier wrote, "If we die now, the Empire will not notice. We are grains of sand in a wave too large to see." They did not cry openly. That was forbidden. But witnesses recalled moments of silence, long and wordless, when men simply looked at the ocean and lowered their heads. Some officers tried to reignite their zeal, shouting the emperor's name, demanding charges, invoking Bushido. But the energy had drained away. The soldiers obeyed, yes, but not from passion anymore. It was mechanical obedience, the ghost of duty. For the first time in the war, Japanese soldiers felt small, not morally, but cosmically, as if the universe itself had turned against them. Psychologists after the war would later describe it as collective fatalism, the EDT moment when a nation's warriors realize that their sacrifice will change nothing. And yet, they continued to fight, not because they still believed in victory, but because surrender was unthinkable. Even when surrounded, even when starving, they clung to one last fragment of identity: that to die for Japan was still better than to live for defeat. When they gazed at the horizon filled with ships, they saw not only the enemy, they saw the measure of their own end. The empire that had once promised eternal glory had led them to a place where courage meant silence, and silence meant acceptance. The endless convoy was not merely a fleet. It was a mirror held up to every soldier's soul, reflecting both their devotion and their futility. That is why, on that morning, they cried in silence. The tears were not of fear, but of recognition that the world they had fought for no longer existed. And as the thunder of engines rolled across the bay, the line between faith and futility vanished forever. When the horizon becomes destiny, the next step is always the breaking point. That breaking point came soon. At Leyte Gulf, when the Japanese command unleashed its final gamble in one of the largest naval battles in human history. The dawn that broke over Leyte was unlike any before. To the east, the sea shimmered with American ships as far as the eye could reach. To the west, Japanese soldiers and sailors prepared for a storm that would decide the fate of their empire. At 0700 hours, the American assault began. From the decks of hundreds of landing ships, thousands of Marines and infantrymen surged toward the beaches under the cover of thunderous naval gunfire. Battleships older than many of the men who served on them hurled shells the size of small cars into the hills. The earth shook as each one struck, turning ridgelines into clouds of dust and fire. The Japanese defenders fired back where they could, but most of their coastal guns were already destroyed from days of bombardment. Their communication lines were shattered. The radio stations crackled with static and half-finished orders. Overhead, American carrier planes filled the skies. Hellcats, corsairs, avengers, and dauntless dive bombers, the greatest concentration of air power the Pacific had ever seen. For the men on the ground, there was nowhere to run. Many Japanese soldiers fired until their ammunition was gone, then charged with bayonets, shouting, "Tenno Heika Banzai!" the emperor's name carried into the smoke. They were met with machine guns and flame. Others waited in caves, allowing the enemy to pass before emerging to fight from behind. Every ridge, every tree line became a miniature death ground. But above and beyond these small battles, a far greater struggle was unfolding, one that stretched hundreds of miles across the sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy, battered but unbroken, had launched its final great operation, Shogo 1. The plan was audacious and desperate. 4 separate naval forces would converge on the American invasion fleet from all directions. Admiral Kurita's center force, including the mighty battleships Yamato and Musashi, would come through the Sibuyan Sea. Admiral Nishimura's southern force would attack through the Surigao Strait. A smaller northern force, under Admiral Ozawa, would act as a decoy with the last of Japan's carriers, luring the U.S. Third Fleet away, and a fourth, minor group would provide auxiliary diversion. The goal was to annihilate the American transports and throw the invasion into chaos. A final, suicidal strike to defend the Philippines. At first, it almost worked. As Ozawa's carriers appeared to the north, Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the powerful U.S. Third Fleet, took the bait. Believing Japan's remaining carriers to be the main threat, he charged northward with his fast battleships and carriers, leaving the invasion beaches temporarily unguarded. Into that gap sailed Admiral Kurita's center force, led by Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. Kurita's ships had already endured hell. As they crossed the Sibuyan Sea, waves of American carrier planes struck them relentlessly. Musashi, the pride of the fleet, took 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before finally capsizing. Thousands of her crew went down with her, swallowed by the sea. Yet Kurita pressed on, driven by orders that spoke not of victory, but of sacrifice. On the morning of October 25th, his fleet emerged from the San Bernardino Strait, directly in front of the lightly armed escort carriers and destroyers of the U.S. 7th Fleet near Samar. What followed was one of the most dramatic and chaotic clashes of the Pacific. War against overwhelming odds. American destroyers and jeep carriers fought back with reckless courage, charging battleships with torpedoes, laying smoke screens, launching planes armed with nothing but machine guns and depth charges. Kurita's heavy cruisers and battleships fired relentlessly, sinking several ships. But confusion, American resistance, and miscommunication spread through the Japanese formation. Believing he faced a much larger force than he did, Kurita hesitated, then withdrew. For the Japanese soldiers on the Leyte beaches, word of the fleet's retreat came like a hammer blow. They had believed salvation might come from the sea, that the great Yamato would appear to drive back the invaders. Instead, all that came was silence. The Empire's last great naval gamble had failed. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, had been shattered. In Tokyo, the official communique still spoke of strategic withdrawals. But the truth was clear. Japan no longer had a fleet capable of defending its empire. On the beaches of Leyte, the surviving soldiers watched as the American tide advanced inexorably inland. The sky above them belonged to another nation now. The horizon, once a symbol of Japan's expansion, had become the boundary of its end. But the war was not yet over. The Tsar's fall of Leyte opened the road to Okinawa, the final barrier before Japan's home islands. There, the Japanese would summon everything they had left: soldiers, civilians, even the skies themselves, in a last act of defiance. At dawn, the sea glowed silver. A faint mist drifted across the waves, and behind it, the world's largest invasion fleet gathered in silence. More than 2,500 ships, carriers, battleships, transports, and destroyers stretched across the horizon in every direction. For miles, the Pacific shimmered like polished metal. From their bunkers along the island's southern ridges, Japanese defenders watched. They were not surprised this time. They had been waiting. But nothing could prepare them for what they saw. The convoy was endless, alive with motion and sound, ships unloading, planes taking off, landing craft forming waves that rippled toward the shore like tides of iron. To one soldier's diary, later found among the ruins, it was written simply, "The ocean has become America." The invasion of Okinawa was the culmination of everything the Pacific War had become. Industrial power against human will, the full weight of an empire's desperation against the cold precision of modern warfare. On the American side stood 180,000 troops, backed by overwhelming naval and air superiority. On the Japanese side, General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded roughly 100,000 defenders, soldiers, Marines, conscripts, and even schoolboys turned fighters. But unlike earlier battles, Ushijima knew this one could not be won. His plan was to make Okinawa a graveyard that would delay the inevitable, to bleed the Americans so badly that they might hesitate before invading Japan's home islands. These Japanese soldiers dug deep into the earth. They carved tunnels, bunkers, and hidden artillery positions through coral ridges. Beneath the island, a city of the dead took shape. Miles of tunnels lit by candles, walls lined with rifles and rations. They would not fight on the beaches. They would let the enemy come inland, then tear him apart. When the American landings began, they met little resistance at first. The beaches were eerily quiet. Soldiers waited ashore expecting gunfire. None came. Only the steady hum of engines, the roar of waves, and the cries of gulls. Then, on the fifth day, the island erupted. Japanese artillery opened up from concealed positions. Kamikaze planes, hundreds of them, screamed down from the clouds, striking ships in fiery suicides. Entire destroyers vanished in plumes of smoke. The sea burned. The sky was filled with falling metal. In Tokyo, the High Command called these men the Thunder Gods. To the Americans who watched them descend, they were the embodiment of tragedy. Pilots who turned themselves into weapons because their nation had nothing left to give. Okinawa became a nightmare of mud, blood, and rain. Every hill had to be taken twice, once by fire, once by hand. The air reeked of decay. The cries of wounded men echoed through the tunnels. For the Japanese defenders, food and water ran out within weeks. They fought from caves, emerging at night to scavenge supplies or ambush patrols. Many carried grenades not for battle, but for themselves, to ensure they would never be captured. American flamethrowers and artillery tore through the underground defenses. Hills were reduced to ash. The once green island became a wasteland of blackened trees and shattered stone. In the chaos, civilians were trapped between both armies. Thousands jumped from cliffs or hid in caves, victims of propaganda that warned of unspeakable horrors if captured. Entire families vanished into the sea. By June, the Japanese defense collapsed. General Ushijima, refusing to surrender, performed seppuku, ritual suicide, in his underground command post. His final message to Tokyo read simply, "We have fought with all our strength. May the Emperor live 10,000 years." When the fighting ended, over 200,000 people were dead. Soldiers, civilians, children. The American fleet had suffered. More than 30 ships sunk, hundreds damaged. and thousands of sailors killed by kamikazes. It was victory at a terrible price. But for the Japanese who survived, the greater pain was not defeat. It was realization. From the caves overlooking the beachheads, they watched the endless American convoys still arriving, unloading fresh troops, trucks, and equipment, even as the battle ended. The ocean was still full of ships, stretching beyond sight, unending, unexhausted. To the starving remnants of Japan's army, the message was unmistakable. No matter how bravely they fought, the enemy's strength would not run out. One survivor later wrote, "At Okinawa, we understood. The war had already been lost long before we fired our first shot. The endless convoy had become a symbol, not just of military power, but of inevitability." As smoke drifted over the ruined hills and the sea glowed red with the reflection of fires, a strange calm fell upon the survivors. The sound of engines far offshore was steady, eternal, like the pulse of a new age. For the men who had once believed the Emperor divine, it was the sound of a world ending. And beyond that horizon, another world, one of machines, of factories, of modernity, was already beginning to rise. When the fires of Okinawa died out, Japan's army was broken, its navy gone, its skies empty. The home islands stood exposed. The silence that followed would not be peace, only the pause before surrender. The battle for Okinawa ended on June 22, 1945. But even as the gunfire fell silent, the island looked more like the surface of another planet. Scorched, cratered, stripped of life. American troops moved among the ruins. Cataloging what remained, the ground was littered with burnt-out tanks, shattered helmets, and silent weapons still gripped by lifeless hands. The stench of death was so thick that soldiers wore masks doused in gasoline to endure it. The United States had won, yet the victory felt hollow. More than 12,000 American soldiers were dead, 49,000 wounded, the costliest battle of the Pacific War. And still, beyond the smoke, Japan refused to surrender. In Tokyo, the news of Okinawa's fall struck like thunder. For the first time, even Japan's leaders began to understand what their soldiers at Leyte and Okinawa had already seen. The enemy's resources were limitless. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, head of the Imperial Navy, admitted bitterly, "We cannot defend the homeland with what remains." The Imperial Navy was gone, sunk or starved of fuel. The Air Force existed mostly on paper, its remaining pilots too inexperienced, its planes too few. Industry had collapsed under American bombing. Cities were burning nightly. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, each reduced to glowing plains of ash. Every day, B-29 bombers came in waves of hundreds, unchallenged. Civilians dug shallow shelters, clutching children as the firestorms swept through. For them, the war had long ceased to be about honor or empire. It was about surviving until dawn. In the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito began to sense the truth his generals still refused to speak aloud. Reports from the front were carefully filtered, but the pattern was unmistakable. Every defense line ended in annihilation. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, the story was the same: bravery against inevitability. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States was preparing for the final act, the invasion of Japan itself, codenamed Operation Downfall. It was to be the largest amphibious invasion in human history, even greater than D-Day. Planners estimated that it would take millions of troops and might cost 1 million American casualties and perhaps 10 million Japanese lives. The sheer scale of Japan's remaining defenses and the fanatical resistance already witnessed terrified the Allied command. For Japan's soldiers, scattered across the Pacific, the news of Okinawa's loss was not surprising, but it was devastating. Those still stranded on isolated islands, cut off from supplies, realized they would never be rescued. Some chose suicide. Others faded into the jungle, living like ghosts. A Japanese sergeant on Mindanao wrote in his diary, "The Emperor's light grows dim. We will fight until the darkness takes us." Yet the darkness was already upon them. Across Asia, Japan's empire disintegrated. In Burma, Thailand, and China, supply lines collapsed. In the Philippines, American forces liberated Manila at the cost of 100,000 civilian lives. On the seas, Japanese merchant shipping was annihilated. By mid-1945, famine had begun to spread through the home islands. For the men who once stood on that ridge overlooking the Pacific, those who had watched the endless convoy appear, the memory lingered. They had seen the truth months earlier when the horizon itself turned to steel. Now the rest of Japan was seeing it too. Factories stood silent. The Imperial Navy's flagships lay rusting at anchor. The kamikaze units had burned themselves out. The empire that once dreamed of ruling the Pacific was starving, blind, and surrounded. Yet Tokyo still refused to surrender. The High Command believed one final, decisive battle on Japanese soil might win them better peace terms, or even force America to hesitate. They were wrong, because at that very moment, across the ocean, in the deserts of New Mexico, scientists were preparing something that would end not only the war, but the world as it had been known. And as the skies over Japan continued to burn, a new kind of fire was about to descend. One no soldier could face, no empire could endure. At 8:15 a.m., a single aircraft appeared in the clear blue sky. Its name was Enola Gay. To the citizens below, it was just another American bomber, one of many that had passed overhead in recent weeks. The air raid sirens had already been called off. People were walking to work, children heading to school, trams moving along the river. Then, without warning, the world turned white. A flash, silent, blinding, eternal. In an instant, the city of 350,000 vanished beneath a pillar of fire. The blast flattened everything within 2 kilometers. Buildings vaporized. Shadows burned into walls. People disappeared where they stood. Within seconds, 70,000 lives were gone. Tens of thousands more would die from burns and radiation in the days that followed. The weapon had no precedent. Its power was beyond comprehension. A son born on Earth. When news reached Tokyo, disbelief turned to dread. Japan's military leaders could not imagine how a single bomb could destroy an entire city. But 3 days later, disbelief ended. August 9th, 1945. Nagasaki. Another bomb. Another flash. Another city erased. The Emperor's advisors met in secret. Some insisted Japan must fight on, that honor demanded death before surrender. Others, broken by the sight of Hiroshima's ruins, begged for peace. That night, Emperor Hirohito made his decision. For the first time in Japanese history, the divine voice of the emperor would be heard by his people. On August 15th, his voice crackled over the radio. Calm, sorrowful, distant. Few understood the archaic language, but the meaning was unmistakable. We must endure the unendurable and accept the surrender. Across Japan, soldiers fell to their knees. Some wept, others refused to believe it. In caves, bunkers, and distant garrisons, entire units committed suicide rather than lay down arms. For them, surrender was impossible. The emperor's silence had once meant divinity. His words now meant defeat. When the news reached those still stranded across the Pacific, the reaction was eerily quiet. Men who had fought for years without food or medicine simply sat down and stared into the distance. A corporal on New Guinea wrote in his final note, "It is over. The convoy we saw has reached our shores. In Tokyo Bay, on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, Japan formally surrendered. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony. Before him stood representatives of a fallen empire. Men who once commanded millions, now reduced to silence. The moment was calm, almost reverent. The sky was clear. The sea reflected the gray hulls of hundreds of Allied ships anchored in still formation. The same endless convoy that had begun years earlier at Leyte. MacArthur spoke briefly. "It is my earnest hope that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge." When the pens were lifted, the war that had consumed the Pacific was over. Japan lay in ruins. 2 cities erased, 60 others burned to ashes, nearly 3 million Japanese dead, most of them civilians. Yet amid the wreckage, something remarkable began to stir. The faint outline of survival. American occupation forces brought food, medicine, and order. War criminals were tried. The old militarist order dismantled. Factories that once built tanks and planes were turned toward steel, cars, and electronics. But beneath the quiet reconstruction, the memories remained. The soldiers who had once watched the horizon, who had seen the endless convoy coming, lived with that vision for the rest of their lives. To them, it was more than the sight of defeat. It was the moment they saw the future. An age when power would no longer be measured in courage or sacrifice, but in industry, technology, and the will to never repeat the same destruction again. When the ashes finally settled, Japan was no longer an empire. It was a survivor, and for the men who had cried in silence on that ridge, watching the sea of ships approach, survival itself had become the last act of honor. The Pacific was quiet again. The same ocean that once thundered with fleets and fire now shimmered under sunlight. Empty, endless, eternal. For those who had lived through it, the war never truly ended. The sounds stayed. The echo of engines. Across the horizon, the rumble of guns, the cries carried by wind. Yet, with time, another sound returned. The hush of peace. Japan, a nation once driven by conquest, became a nation of creation. The ashes of its empire became the foundation of something unexpected: resilience. From the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rose cities of light, not war. From the silence of defeat came generations determined to rebuild, to understand, to never look upon such destruction again. Historians often mark the Pacific War by its battles. Midway, Leyte, Okinawa. But for those who fought, its meaning lived in smaller moments. The glance of a comrade before battle, the final note in a diary, the sight of the horizon turning to steel. That morning at Leyte, when the Japanese soldiers watched the endless convoy appear, they witnessed not just the might of the enemy, but the arrival of a new age. An age when war would no longer be decided by courage alone, but by the machine, by industry, by the sheer force of progress. And yet, within that revelation lay something deeper. Because even in the face of hopelessness, they had not turned away. They had watched in silence the death of their world, and in that silence was a kind of dignity. History remembers wars for their victors, but it is often in the quiet tears of the defeated that we find the true weight of what was lost. As night once again falls over the Pacific, the ghosts of those who stood on that ridge remain. Not as soldiers, but as witnesses. Witnesses to the end of an empire and to the beginning of the modern world that followed. And somewhere, beyond memory and time, the horizon still glows, a faint line of light stretching endlessly across the sea.